Thank you. So let's listen to how some of this electricity works. So that was electricity being reconstructed in your brain from the vibrations in the room. It's a pretty remarkable process. And for me, I was always deeply obsessed and fascinated by this. I just wanted to know how it happened, how it could be that something in a way so ephemeral and abstract could change my life. And for many of you that love music, you know that music can change your life. I mean, there's some people who really they basically live and die for it. And so I felt that way. I just didn't have the talent. And so I wanted to kind of use my time to try to understand this phenomenon of music deeper. And so I went naturally into otolaryngology and otology, thinking that it would be a good field to explore music. And so what I found when I got there was this. Okay. So blips and bleeps. And so most of what when I entered the field of otolaryngology, I finished medical school in 1996. There was really no precedent for studying music in a sort of scientific way, certainly not in otolaryngology. And so I had to kind of grapple with the fact that we were at the level of just hearing blips and bleeps, and we were very, very far away from what I actually wanted to study, which was music. Now, I want to introduce you to this girl, okay? And so let's take a look at her. Her name is Grace, and this is her with her mother.
That's an owl. Owl. Yeah. Owl. Owl. Yeah. Baby.
It's a beautiful baby and a sweet mother. And you may have noticed, some of you that are in the field, that this child is deaf. So she can't hear anything. She's born congenitally deafened, and her mother's doing whatever she can to try to provide input to this child's brain. And things have thankfully evolved over time. So in the 1800s, we used to do things like stick funnels in your ears or ear-shaped objects in your ears. And now we have the modern multi-channel cochlear implant, which hopefully is just one step of a much greater evolution. For those of you that were paying attention to the news in the past few weeks, some really exciting developments have happened in our field. It was kind of a watershed moment for all of neuroscience, but really maybe for all of humanity, because the first case of genetic hearing loss was essentially reversed using gene therapy for point mutations. But right now we're at the stage where the best option for somebody who's deaf is a cochlear implant. And so here is Grace now, 11 years later. She did receive a cochlear implant early on in life, and here she is with her mother.
So you've written 2 books.
I've written 2 books.
Was the other one a book or like a journal entry?
No, the other one was a book.
Oh, okay.
But yeah.
Well, this book has 7 chapters, and the last chapter is entitled "The Good Things About Being Deaf." Do you remember writing that chapter?
Yes, I do. I remember writing every chapter.
Yeah.
Well, sometimes my sister can be kind of annoying, and so it comes in handy to not be annoyed by her.
I see. And who is that?
Collie.
Oh, okay.
Her sister.
Her sister.
My sister.
And how can you avoid being annoyed by her?
I just take off my CI and I don't hear anything. So it's pretty, it comes in handy.
So you don't want to hear everything that's out there?
No.
So she's an amazing CI user, can take questions from a stage, really natural speech, and just a great kid. But one thing happens when she turns on the radio. She does not like most of the music that she's hearing. Now, why is that? It's because of a phenomenon that many implantees have described, which is that prior to these are all adults, but prior to their hearing loss, nobody says they didn't like listening to music. This is like saying you don't like to eat something that tastes good. Like, people like to hear music, generally speaking. But after CI, up to 40% of people are saying they don't like to hear it, right? So something that was pleasant has now become aversive. And that's a pretty interesting phenomenon when you think of how successful we are or are not in our interventions. So we have to contend with the fact that despite these overwhelming successes with spoken language, most CI users cannot hear music well. And by implication, cochlear implants can't handle music. Music is too difficult to stimulus for a cochlear implant, which is essentially a speech processing device to be able to transmit. So let's delve into this and say, what is music actually? And so it's a hard thing to define. I'm not generally one for definitions, but in something like this, maybe it's helpful to break it down a little bit structurally. So music is sound of various timbres and dynamics. It's organized sound, and it's organized according to principles of pitch, rhythm, and harmony. You can say this about many, many types of sound, but music certainly falls in this category. Music is not new. This is a fossilized bone flute, recovered, it has holes in it to allow you to play tones. This is thought to be 35,000 years ago. So human beings 35,000 years ago somehow cared about music. With everything else that they had to deal with, they cared about making music. We might be hardwired to make music in the same way that we might be hardwired to communicate to one another. And so let's consider for a moment that music may have an evolutionary role in our being here today, because it allowed humans to bond to one another, communicate to one another, even from different parts of the world and regions. Let's also contend with the fact that if you look at the acoustics of music and speech, music is actually quite a bit more challenging because it has a broader dynamic range and a much greater frequency range, because actually any sound is fair game for music. You can put any sound in the world into music, whereas for speech, it's a much narrower kind of acoustic spectrum. No offense, Dr. Stormer. And so you have to now ask the question of what does music actually sound like to a cochlear implant user? And I know there are some people in the room here that have a lot more experience listening to music with CIs than I have ever had. I can tell you that having studied a lot of people that have CIs, we can actually analyze it according to these very basic principles: pitch, rhythm, timbre, sound quality, dynamics. And we can see that in every one of these aspects, there's problems, with the exception, generally speaking, of rhythm. And that's to say that cochlear implants transmit temporal information with high fidelity. They're pretty good at timing, right? And that kind of makes sense when you think about what it's doing. It responds when the signal is present. It's really bad. If you look at the things in red, those are the things that the implant is struggling with. So pitch is probably the area where a cochlear implant struggles the most. And if you think about what that means for music, it's kind of devastating. So music is basically out of tune entirely for most CI users. And as a result of that being out of tune, there's a whole host of things that happen after it, which basically leads you to be unable to really properly receive the full musical message. You may get a musical message, but it's not necessarily the one that was intended by the composer or the producer of the music. And all of that leads to, in the end, some sort of change in the emotional percept that you're getting when you hear something like music, so that it's not quite what was originally intended. And so there's a distortion that happens that limits your ability to really get the information. So the first obstacle, and if you could fix one thing for a CI user with music, you would fix pitch. And so let's go into the reasons why pitch is off for a CI user. So in order for you to have normal pitch inside your inner ear, a couple of things have to happen. The cochlea, this spiral-shaped structure, it operates by two main principles. One is where you stimulate it inside it, that's called place pitch, and how fast, that's called rate pitch. And for normal hearing, those things go together. So where you're stimulating is always at the same rate. That's how it actually works. But in CI hearing, neither of those things is accurate. You're not stimulating at the right place, and you're not stimulating at the right rate. So you're now disrupted both your place and rate pitch mechanisms, and that's part of the reason why you're going to have a problem with it. Now, if you just look at the actual physics and the physical structure of a cochlear implant electrode, you'll see right away that that's just not enough, right? So here, this is just one example, but you've got these 12 contacts sitting inside the inner ear. How is that going to provide the electrical function of thousands and thousands of neurons that are, finely tuned, to an extreme degree of precision? It just can't work. And so if you look at the electrodogram, which is the electrical representation of a sound, and you start modifying sounds very, very slightly, you'll see that the electrodogram doesn't change. And so there's no change in electrical representation that's representing what's happening in the world. Furthermore, the nerve may not see a different signal, even if the electrodogram changed slightly because of channel interactions. Which means that in the end, if you think about how tight a piano keyboard is actually tuned, which is about 15 hertz between middle C and the semitone above or below, you'll never right now with current technology be able to get a CI in tune in terms of absolute pitch matching, which leads us to think that maybe we should forego absolute pitch matching for the time being and go for relative pitch matching, which is to say that, okay, it's not actually in tune, but the distances between one pitch and its neighbor are accurate, so that even if you don't hear the pitch completely in the same exact pitch range, you still hear a transposed version of it. So instead of da-da-da-da for Beethoven, you might hear da-da-da-da, like something like that, okay? You can still make out that it was Beethoven's fifth. Not that you could make that out from my version, but in theory, one could make that. So when you look at a piano keyboard that should have this kind of logical structural arrangement, for a CI user, it's much more something like this. In fact, this is probably better than how it is for a lot of CI users for a couple of reasons. One is that at least there are basically all the keys here. And there are no keys that are particularly wide, which is the case with a CI user. Most of the times, if you're playing up the keyboard for a CI user, there'll be several keys in a row where they will tell you that they're the same note. Okay? And the analogy has been that you're trying to play the piano with a boxing glove on or a mitten on, and you just can't hit all the keys. The other thing is that there's no reversals here. As you travel upward, you expect the sound to get higher. But in the case of some CI listeners, there's little reversals where you're going higher and higher on the keyboard, but the sound percept gets lower and lower for a short period of time and then corrects. And so pitch happens to be one of the least robust stimuli to degradation. And so let's just do a little experiment here. This is a MIDI scroll rendition of a Rachmaninoff piece that many of you probably know. Now, if you took that piece and you randomized it to the nearest semitone, okay, so one neighbor on a piano keyboard, that would be great for CI listeners to get closest to the nearest semitone. But this is what one semitone randomization does to that piece. So we're in a situation where music is not robust to pitch degradation. The moment you just start distorting the pitches, even just a little bit, it really changes what you're hearing and creates unwanted dissonances, which is probably a lot of the reason why something that's pleasant can become aversive. In a series of studies, we tried to look a little bit more deeply into why this is the case. What is a CI user listening when they make a determination for how much they like something? And so we all kind of know this idea that some music is happy and some music is sad, and it's been kind of in a very simplistic fashion been linked to whether that piece is major or minor. And so some of you that are musicians understand that the difference between a major and a minor chord is really just a half step on the third. And so if you start with something that's major and fast, people tend to think that's happy. It sounds like this. Most people would say, yeah, that's kind of happy. And then if you take it and you make it a minor version and you make it slow, it sounds like this. And most people say, okay, that's kind of sad. And you can kind of see right then and there, something that's fast and major seems happy, something that's slow and minor seems sad. But what about the ambiguous conditions? What about something that's minor but fast? It sounds like this. And what about the other option? Something that's major in key but slow. And most of you are probably sensing that, it's not really either of those because it's a compound emotion. It's more complex than just saying it's happy or sad. And this is why music has depth. That's why it can get to real nuances of what it means to be human. So if you take normal hearing listeners, the people that hear happy major say that it does sound more happy, and then likewise for the slow minor. But in the middle, they're clustered around the meaning of zero. They can't tell you which emotion it is. CI users on the right do something very different. If it's fast, it's happy. If it's slow, it's sad. They cannot pay attention to the mode. So if you think about the idea between major and minor being a big deal musically, and a CI user saying that they have no difference in whether it sounds happy or sad, it gives you a clue to what they're missing when they hear the sound. Likewise, if you take a melody and you start introducing intentional dissonance to it, it sounds like this. So that's the major one. And now this one is more dissonant. And most people that hear that would tell you that the more dissonant one sounds less pleasant. But again, not the CI users. The normal hearing users are in gray. They're saying it sounds worse when they're hearing more dissonance. The CI users are not. They're telling you that it sounds about the same across the board. And so again, something that is extremely totally consonant to something that's as distant pretty much as you can make it, they're saying it sounds about the same when it comes to something like pleasantness. There's another phenomenon, which is that, and when you're listening to music, you're not, you're just trying to perceive the sound of it. You're not trying to analyze it necessarily. The same goes with whether you're hearing one note or two. And so in the lab, we always test people on one note at a time for doing pitch alignments, but music is rarely monophonic. And so in this study, we tried to ask a CI user to tell us the difference between whether they hear one, two, or three. And most people with normal hearing can do that test fairly well. And if you're going to make an error, you're going to say that a 3 is a 2. If you're presented with 3, most people with normal hearing are not going to say it's a 1. And that's why their confusion matrix shows only 8% of errors go in that direction for normal hearing. But for a CI user, when you hear a 3, you're more likely to say it's a 1 than a 2. Okay? And that's, again, gets this idea of lack of precision when handling multiple pitches that are close to one another. And we call this polyphonic pitch fusion. Right? So there's a fusion of polyphonic pitches into one percept. And if you understand how much of music is polyphonic in nature, it makes you understand that there's a big problem. And so that's the pitch issue. Now let's get to this idea of sound quality, which is, in a sense, like if music doesn't sound good, what's the point, right? Like how many people want to listen to music like through a telephone? It's just not really the way you want to hear music. It actually always amazes me if you look at the frequency spectrum range of a hearing aid and then you compare it to like an audio speaker. Like you would never, ever, ever purchase a piece of audio equipment that has a frequency range of a hearing aid. You'd be like, there's no way. This is like just not going to work. I mean, it ends at 8,000 hertz. I mean, there's not a single pair of stereo speakers that would be sold like that. Yet this is what we are trying to give somebody that has hearing loss just to hear. And that's the same for a cochlear implant. Now, the issue is sort of analogous to that of a glass of wine. And so when I moved to the Bay Area, I knew very little about wine because we frankly didn't have that much of it in Baltimore, except for Dr. Lustig. Now, here in the Bay Area, everyone seemingly knows about wine. Tina, maybe you experienced this too when you moved here. It's like, wow, there's so many wine lists everywhere you go. But for me, if you put a $5 glass bottle of wine in front of me and a $50 bottle of wine, I might not actually be able to tell you which is the more expensive one. When I first got here, I've gotten a little better. Okay. But the fault wasn't the wine's fault. It was my fault. I didn't have the palate for it. And this is the exact thing that happens with a CI user. It's not the music's fault. You can play the most expensive audio setup to a CI user and then play music off your iPhone, and they might not really be able to tell you which is the better, higher quality stimulus. And so I'm going to present to you two case studies of people that are going to describe this to you. Here is a first subject who's actually quite happy with what they're hearing.
Music sounds very good to me with my cochlear implant. Much better than when I had hearing aids. I think I benefit from the fact that I never had the musician's schooled ear, learned ear, where my sense of pitch was never that good. So I've heard some musicians that have cochlear implants are not that happy with how music works for them. But for me, I think ignorance is bliss because it sounds terrific to me.
So he's happy, but what happens when he participates in our experiments? He's terrible. right? So he's very bad at every task we throw at him, but he's super happy about it. Okay? And so he's somebody who's be perfectly fine drinking the $5 bottle of wine. He's like, this is great. Right? He's like downing his glass, loves it. Okay? Here's someone who's not quite as happy.
Sometimes music is just like this cacophonous noise where it's just like in the way and I don't know what's going on and I'm trying to hear other things that are going on around me and the music is just overpowering. Other times music is really soothing and helpful, and if I'm in a quiet environment I can pick up positive aspects of music. A lot of the times it just sounds like it's in the way, like it's something that I know that other people obviously enjoy hearing. I'm like, why is this here? Why does this need to be here? This is just distracting me from whatever is actually going.
When you test her, she actually does quite well, right? But she's annoyed. Okay? She doesn't want the $5 wine. She wants the $50 wine. And so we have this thing where most CI users will tell you that their CI sounds okay. Now, the more expectations you have, the closer you are to being an audiophile, if you are a trained musician or a professional musician, the more disappointment you're likely to experience when you actually are hearing through a CI. And so how do you actually assess sound quality? Because it's a sort of subjective thing. And we've been using something called the CI musher as a way to try to assess sound quality, what it actually sounds like for a CI user by comparing not whether you like something, but whether you like it compared to a comparator that's not been distorted. So we start intentionally distorting pieces of music to see whether or not your preference is altered by that. If it's not, you can't perceive it. So it's a probe. And so we're trying to see right now, can we use assessments of sound quality to measure the impact of removing bass frequencies from music? Most of you know that a cochlear implant has a problem. It doesn't reach the apex of the cochlea. Right? So by definition, there's a low frequency problem with cochlear implants. You will never get true bass in most CI setups. Now, you can then ask the question, well, what does that lead to, what sort of problems does that produce in someone's life? Turns out low frequencies are incredibly important, but for the purposes of just a musical experiment, let's think about it this way. Let's take music and let's eliminate bass from it. Okay? Let's just get rid of some bass and let's hear whether or not a CI user is affected by this. Now, this is an example of a spectrogram. You can see these progressively less and less bass heavy versions of a piece of music. And then this is the sort of interface that we use. This is called the CI musher. The CI musher was a modification of what's used in the audio industry for when MP3s were first developed and people were trying to say, hey, how close is an MP3 to an actual original high quality recording? You have to get pretty nuanced about it. And so there are different compression algorithms to create MP3s, and you would have normal hearing users give you these ratings that were comparing the MP3 to the original. In this case, we're comparing the original to one without bass in a fashion that's blinded to you. So you don't know what you're hearing, you don't know what the manipulation was, but you just give a rating of it. And so it sounds like this. This is Usher. That was before the Super Bowl. We predated Usher's Super Bowl appearance, which I thought was okay. Now, here is Usher with full bass. And let me just say, Stanford is a beautiful campus, but you need better speakers here. Yes. And so here's an example of how jazz might sound. No bass. And full bass. So if you take normal hearing users in the darker bars, you can see that when you remove the bass, they're basically they're tracking it spot on. Okay, they're telling you right away, okay, that's less and less good. They don't know what they're hearing. They just can tell you that sounds less and less good. CI users can make the determination, but it's blunted. Okay, it's a blunted response. It takes a lot more loss of bass for them to be able to hear that that's happened. And so again, you could use that as a probe by saying the closer you get to the more normal curve, the better job we've done at giving you bass back. And so some of our experiments are now designed to use these things, like I said, as probes to see how well we're doing when we now modify your, say, processing strategy to try to deliver more bass to you. And so I've given you a lot of dismal information. And so this is meant to be optimistic, probably only I would see it that way. Does anybody know who this is? I don't know if Dr. Orloff is still here. Oh, this is Beethoven, okay? And so why would we have Beethoven's skull? Because there are no famous people in the world whose like skulls you can go look at, okay? But Beethoven, you can. Why is that? Because his grave was exhumed twice, actually, in an effort to, one, solve why he lost his hearing, and then also to move his grave. And there's actually molding clay on the side there, the right temporal bone. You can see the temporal bones are actually extracted. And then so the skull was put together with molding clay. That was actually led to a theory that he might have Paget's disease of the bone at one point, which is why his skull was thick, but the actual skull fragments are not so. And many of you that live down here may not know this, but in San Jose State University, the Ira Brilliant Beethoven Center, you can actually go there if you make an appointment and hold Beethoven's hair. It's the most amazing experience. I thought it would not be because give me that hair. So I'm holding, all of a sudden, like, oh my God, I'm holding Beethoven's hair. And so his bone thickness is normal. His hair was thought to have lead issues and things like that. But Beethoven lost his hearing early, relatively speaking, in his life, yet created amazing music for the remainder of his life. So at the Third Symphony, for those of you that are Beethoven files, Eroica Symphonies, when he first was noted to have hearing loss, he started actually panicking. And right after that, Symphony 4, 5, and 6, in a rapid period of development. By the time of the Ninth Symphony, profound hearing loss, all the accounts of him conducting or guest conducting the Ninth Symphony are that he couldn't hear any of it, couldn't hear the applause that he was getting, and that the soloist had to turn him around to face the audience so that he could realize that he had a standing ovation. So this is Beethoven, and it's a reason for optimism because even though he lost his hearing, he didn't lose his musical brain. So it suggests that the musical brain, once it's formed, will persist, even in the context of hearing loss, and that you can employ this kind of training that your brain has had and musicality that your brain has to help you perceive sound afterwards. So how do we maybe fix this situation for music? There are a couple of things we can try to do. I'm going to list 3 ideas here. One is that you can try to change the CI. One is that you can try to change the brain. And one is that you can try to change the music. These are all basic approaches to how you might improve this. And so tripolar stimulation is one way to try to do this. Now, I talked a little bit about how currents comes out of the electrode in a way that's not that precise. And part of that is because we often use monopolar stimulation, so the electricity just kind of disperses. So maybe you could focus the dispersion a little bit by putting little flanking side currents in something called tripolar stimulation and create a narrower little band of excitation. It turns out if you do the polyphonic pitch study using a tripolar strategy, you're actually better at differentiating whether there were 3 or 2 than if you, and this is a relatively simple thing to implement. So now we're finding a way that you can narrow the way current shoots towards the nerve and maybe improve someone's ability to tell you how many notes there were. Now, here I have to thank one of your great residents here. So Tina Mandela, many of you may know this, but she was a medical student with me at Johns Hopkins. So I got to work with her first, and she, one of the greatest students I had in my lab. And so we worked on a study together. It was called phantom electrodes. Phantom electrodes are a pretty neat idea. So advanced bionics engineers had realized that if you do something called partial bipolar stimulation, you can actually fire the direction of the current away from the electrode, out past the tip. Okay, so the theory was that you could fire it beyond the reach of the physical limit of the electrode. And if you fired it towards the apex, you might actually get more low frequency stimulation. And so with this phantom strategy in mind, we then put cochlear implant users, we turned phantom on, and then we had them do that bass experiment where we got rid of more and more bass. And lo and behold, the phantom users had a more normal response. Okay, so they were testing more and more like normal hearing users. And so it was kind of a very simple manipulation that led to, in my mind, something that could be actually commercializable. And so this is something that I think is happening internally right now in advanced bionics. There were some implications of hearing low frequencies that's not just in hearing usher better, but in changing the way you hear something like voices. And so it turned out that people that had phantom on, their family members were saying, hey, you sound more like yourself when you talk to me. Why is that? And there's an auditory feedback thing that happens through a CI and through much of hearing loss, which is that you're hearing sounds now in a different way that changes the way you produce sounds because you're sort of modulating your voice according to what you're hearing. And it turns out that if you have phantom on, your fundamental frequency of your voice is closer to that of the general population for formants 2 and 3, and for certain parts of formant 1 in males, than if you have phantom off. So again, a pretty simple manipulation, just firing the electricity a little bit more towards the apex. You're getting more low frequency information. You're modulating your voice in a way that now sounds truer to how you sounded before you had your hearing loss. Kind of an unexpected finding. Other ways to get low frequency hearing. Now, many of you don't know this, but we actually do what's called a hearing preservation cochlear implant. It's a kind of an odd sounding thing, because why would you put a cochlear implant in if somebody has hearing? Well, turns out that there are degrees of hearing loss. So if you have a lot of low frequency hearing, like this person has, but very poor word recognition, you can still get a cochlear implant. Okay? So you don't need to be completely deaf to get a CI today. And you can theoretically preserve hearing. So this is a surgery where we're trying to put this electrode in an atraumatic way. Okay, and so I'll cut to the chase a little bit here. So here's an electrode that's going to go into the round window, a little decompression of perilymph, and so the lead's about to go in here. Now it's just inside the cochlea, and then as pretty much as painfully, excruciating slowly as you can insert it, you try to manually feed this into the cochlea over a course of about a minute or so. And so I'm not going to take you through it, but this is about the rate. You can see very slowly these electrodes going in. And so here's this patient's now post-op audiogram. Okay, so this is where they were pre-op, and this is where they are post-op. So they've preserved their hearing in that ear, at least for the time being. Fibrosis and whatnot may occur that may one day render that moot, but for the purposes of the surgical experiment, we didn't sacrifice their low frequency hearing. And so now maybe that person can do a better job of the base experiment for Musha. Now I asked the question of, I posed the dilemma that CIs were out of tune. And so the question naturally is, can you actually retune them? Can you get a CI in tune? And so we've been doing a series of projects over the past really now 10 years, using high resolution flat panel CT imaging to look at how these electrodes sit. And so it turns out that there's a lot of variability in how a cochlear implant electrode sits inside the cochlea. And so if you actually look at the fine detail, you'll realize, oh, these are very different insertions, but they're all the same device and same manufacturer. And so what's the problem? The problem is that there's a default map setting when you turn on a CI. So if all of us got CIs today and we all had it inserted with the same device, we'd all have essentially the same map. Okay? That's independent of how big our cochleas actually are and where the electrode is actually sitting inside our inner ears. It's a big problem in our field. And it's one that hasn't really been identified because small transpositions of pitch are not going to really affect speech. Okay? In the same way that, if my voice is slightly higher or slightly lower, it doesn't really matter to your ability to hear me. But it matters a lot when you talk about something like tuning. And so again, here's an example of an electrode that's not fully inserted as much on the left as it is on the right, but these would have the same maps when they shouldn't have it. So the question is whether or not you can use this imaging data to give you a better localization of the location of a neuron and then the assigned pitch. And we all know about this idea of Greenwood's frequency position, which is that a certain location has a certain, thank you, Dr. Lem, good luck on your case, that a certain, now that he's gone, I have to tell you the story of Michael Lim, just quickly. He's like the nicest human I've ever known. So there's a great restaurant in Baltimore called Sammo's. My wife and I are driving to the city on a Saturday, and it's about 4 o'clock. And I was like, hey, we should go to Sammo's. Let's see if Mike wants to join. So I call Mike up and say, hey, we're about to hit Sammo's for dinner. You want to join us? Like 5 or 6. He's like, yeah, sure. I'll see you there. So we're sitting at Sammo's. You have to wait about 45 minutes to get your table. We're eating. I'm like, God, this meal is so good. When was the last time you were here? And he goes, oh, actually, I had lunch here. And I said, today? He said, yeah. Well, Mary and I really like. I was like, Mike, you had lunch at this restaurant, drove 45 minutes home, and then when I called you, you drove back. And because I want to have sandwich, you didn't tell me that you had just eaten there. I always got mad at him, right? But that's the kind of person Michael Lim is. Yes, for all of his academic accolades, I'll always remember for the person who let me have Samos without telling me that he had just had it. So back to the CIs. I digress. So Greenwood's function is this relationship between where something is in the cochlea and what pitch you assign it to. And it turns out that we're not doing a good job of mimicking Greenwood's function or the modified version of that, which is the Stokowski function. And so if you look at the place pitch mismatch for electrodes and where they are, you can see right away that there's a big mismatch between where an electrode actually is in orange and where it should be in black. And so there's an average pitch mismatch that can reach as much as 1.5 octaves for different electrodes, particularly at the base and the apex. And so we did this thing where we had pitches out of tune and we had them retune it. So you have to kind of order it sequentially once you've had your CI mapped according to your CAT scan. And according to your CAT scan, which is now referred to as anatomy-based fitting, we're seeing that patients were doing better at pitch reversal tasks when they have the map properly done. Now, this is a work in progress. We're actually going to be presenting this at the ACIA meeting over the next, I guess it's in summertime. So hopefully we'll have some more details for you, but it does appear to be that there's an advantage to anatomy-based mapping. Whether that advantage is in music or whether music is the best way to test it, I can't tell you. Do I think we've tuned it perfectly? No, not at all, because we still only have the same number of electrodes. And so I think what's happening is that our electrode's in a better location, but now we have to do a task that really shows you whether those center frequencies are now better in tune. I mentioned the idea of changing the brain. And so you can actually change the brain. We change our brains all the time. That's why you guys are in here trying to learn. You're changing your brain. And so there was an experiment that I did when I worked with David Mugo, who was my mentor at Johns Hopkins for basic science, where we did a series of implants in deaf white cats. And so if any of you have a white cat and it's not listening to you, you hopefully understand that it might be deaf. There's a lot of deafness in white cats. And so this is this cat that's now has a custom electrode that's placed inside its ear, and it's being trained to respond to a bugle call for food. And so this is how this cat does. And it's specific to that trumpet call. Another trumpet call won't work. I'm not suggesting that cat likes trumpet, knows it's listening to trumpet, or finds this entertaining or anything. What I'm saying is we've now taken an abstract stimulus and imbued it with meaning for a cat that's deaf. And so we've trained its brain to respond to this specific idea. So if we turn to the brain, obviously it's the root of how all sound is processed. And so we can look at functional neuroimaging as a way to understand these very kind of core ways in which we hear. And this is the reason why I actually went to the NIH, just because I got frustrated by looking at the cochlea and the eardrum and trying to understand how we hear music. And so I wanted to understand how the brain does this thing. And so what we really want is something like this that allows us to kind of look inside someone's head. And what we have instead is something for, at least for CI users, PET scanning. MRI scanning, for obvious reasons, is not great for cochlear implant users. So you can't really do functional MRI for a CI user. Now, PET scanning has some advantages. It's quiet, it's non-magnetic, so it works well. It happens to be quite low in spatial resolution, and you have to have radioactive substances injected into your vein. And so subject recruitment on this was a little challenging, but we were able to do it. Now, PET scanning works the following way. We're not talking about the kind of PET scanning that shows you tumors. Okay? This is, sorry for anyone who's in head and neck here and got excited about PET scanning for a moment. This is O15 water PET scanning. So it's equivalent to functional brain mapping using water that's been tagged. And so the positrons from the O15 water go into your body. They meet native electrons, they annihilate, there's a dispersion of energy, and you can then pinpoint where that dispersion of energy came from. And you can now say, hey, this is what normal listeners look like when you're listening to some sound. And this is what a CI user looks like when you're listening to some sound. And so if you just go through slice by slice and look at the activation maps on this, you'll see that it's remarkably similar. almost to the point where you're like, wow, you've done it. Right? It's the same. Right? We've now created, reproducible brain function in somebody with a CI user. And yes, we're doing a great job with this, but it turns out that there's a magnitude issue. Okay, so if you actually do a subtraction map and you look at the differences, you'll find out that there's always more activity in the brain for the CI user listening to the same thing than a normal hearing user. And so the contrast map always shows greater activity in the CI user. Furthermore, you can break that down by certain kinds of stimuli. You can break it down to language, rhythm, and melody. And I said at the outset, this is the contrast map. I said at the outset that CIs are designed for speech. And so that's essentially what you're seeing on the top is a pretty robust speech response greater than normal hearing. But melody, you're actually seeing not the same thing. And so maybe this is a clue that what we're really trying to do is to get the neural response for something like melody to approximate that of the normal response for something like language in a CI user to overcompensate for the fact that it's distorted. And how might you actually, and this is what the comparison maps look like, you never see more activity in the control subjects than in CI subjects. So you might be able to take a kid and train them. So this is a child that participated in a CI course, CI music class that we started at Peabody Conservatory of Music, where I used to be faculty, where we trained kids to hear basic music things, then we tested them. And it turns out that even before trainings, there was a little bit of hope because kids that were doing a same different task were better than chance by quite a bit and almost as good as normal hearing users. So these are kids that were implanted at 1 year of age or so. And when they were tested in this class, which is between 4 to 6 years of age, they were actually performing close to their normal hearing peers on a simple same different task. Also, if you look at kids in Taiwan and kids in the US, the tonal language effect of being raised in Taiwan affects your brain. And normal hearing kids in Taiwan are better at pitch sweep tasks. Okay? You can see their performance as the blue dot compared to the red dot. The open circles are the normal hearing conditions. The filled in circles are the CI conditions. Once you put a CI on, the effect is blunted. There's a slight performance advantage for having been raised in Taiwan when you do a pitch sweep task, but it's really muted, whereas the normal hearing user has a huge advantage. But maybe in the same way that musical training can affect your ability to hear pitches, being raised in a place where you're hearing and reliant on pitch sweeps is a way to also improve your ability to pay attention or to differentiate between these things. And then finally, a musical training task where we take someone who's musically naive and you give them a keyboard and you have them listen to things while looking at a piano keyboard to try to improve their ability to kind of internalize the idea of melodic contour. And it turns out that after training, you're better at hearing melodic contours in a piano. And you haven't changed the hearing at all. All you've done is you've just trained the brain more. And so we have evidence that training matters. And then I referred to lastly changing the music. And let me give you an example of how this might work. So if you take a piece of music, you can actually, it's mixed a certain way. There's a ratio between the vocals and the music. And so here's the baseline ratio. Now, using certain kind of machine algorithms, you can actually selectively diminish the vocals. This is not, I don't have the source tracks, okay? I'm not like working with Bruno Mars to do this, okay? You just take the recording and you do it to this. Maybe I'll tell, those vocals are reduced by 9 dB, okay? Now this is the opposite. These are boosted by 9 dB. And if you look at sound quality ratings, CI users will tell you that the vocal boost sounds best. Again, they don't know what the manipulation is, but they're saying, I like that better. So it turns out that changing the music does actually lead to a CI user liking more, maybe because they have to attend to the linguistic elements of a piece of music. And then likewise, if you have musical training, that's even a more pronounced effect for the vocal boost. Now, this is a woman. I'm going to have her introduce herself. She was post-op, and she told me, I said, hey, how's it going with your CI? It's brand new. She says, oh, it's great. I can tune my guitar. I was like, what? That's not possible. I was like, show me. And so she sent me a video.
This is an advanced bionics cochlear implant with a high-res 120 and a harmony processor. I'm going to start with my guitar and tune. Okay, now I'm going to take it out of tune and retune it. Okay,
She doesn't have a
again.
hearing aid. She doesn't have residual hearing. So she does get this thing in tune. I didn't believe her, so I had her close her eyes and someone else did it. And she can do it just by listening to it too. Turns out she's probably doing a temporal task. And she's probably listening to beating patterns between out of tune notes and using that to resolve the difference. But she does get this thing in tune.
Okay,
And so this is her now doing it by ear. And so those are all bits of evidence that we can make things better, although I'll tell you, we have a really long way to go. I think the CI field has plateaued. Like right now, if you just look globally at where we are performance-wise, we've kind of hit a performance plateau. And so we need to start thinking outside of the box, or I think in a more innovative way to try to get past that plateau. I just want to close by telling you a little bit about an initiative that we've been working on, which is called the Sound Health Network, which really gets this idea of music as medicine. And so some of you may know this already, but Francis Collins is a musician. And not only is he a musician, but he's collaborators now with Renee Fleming, opera superstar. And it turns out that both of them have decided to make this kind of a personal mission to try to improve the understanding of music and how it affects health and well-being. And so they convened a gathering at the NIH with the Kennedy Center, the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts. This is back in 2017, this published in 2018, where the findings were released, where we were basically informing the NIH about the state of music research at the time. Then we assembled all these artists together that were working with us on this. And so these are people that have all participated in what became known as the Sound Health events. And this is a little short video about how this works.
Sound Health is a new initiative we're exploring with the NIH. Under the leadership of Renee Fleming, who began this dialogue with Dr. Collins, we're really looking to find out how is a creative life a more healthy life.
It's an exciting time in neuroscience. We're starting to learn ways in which music can influence all kinds of other aspects of one's brain function, and especially how we could use that information to use music therapeutically.
When I met Francis Collins, who I discovered was a really terrific musician, it occurred to me this might be an opportunity. If people are, through music therapy, succeeding in helping patients, children with autism, patients with Parkinson's, stroke victims who can then communicate because they can sing but they can't speak, the science of healing in the arts. It's another area of exploding research.
This has a research component to it, it has a presentational component to it, it has an advocacy component to it as well in terms of where culture in America today is going.
Through this initiative, we can all learn from each other and we can move into a new space of integration of deep intellectual and scientific thought.
The fact that this is coming together, that the NIH and the Kennedy Center are collaborating, it makes the arts more relevant. It exalts the importance of the arts in our lives.
So we held this roundtable at the NIH where we discussed some of these implications, and shortly thereafter, the NIH announced their first set of $20 million of funding to support music research, and then that's been upped again. So now they've actually put $40 million towards music research, which is not a lot by NIH standards. In fact, some of your labs here probably have $40 million of funding just to do your one lab's work, but it's never happened before. And so this is the first time that the NIH kind of put music on the map, and so we're very glad for it. The National Endowment for the Arts then entered the picture and did a call for proposal for something called the Sound Health Network, which I'm now the co-director of. And so we launched actually during COVID. If you care about this kind of thing, please join the website. This is our mission statement, which is to promote the research into the public awareness on the impact of music on health and wellness. So just in conclusion, music is what I call the pinnacle of hearing. There's critical impairments in cochlear implant listening, which reveal why implants are not quite where we need them to be. Primarily, they're out of tune, but there's a lot of things we need to do. Change the design, change processing strategies, change our training paradigms, and maybe change music itself. And so with that, I just want to thank these funding sources and collaborators, and then people that I've worked with over the years. People on the right are my lab members who, without none of this would ever have happened. And so very grateful for your time today, and thanks for having me.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Dr. Lim. We have time for a question.
Hey, Kay.
Oh, okay. All right. Charles, that was a fabulous talk. And I had a question for you. You might have kind of gotten into this when you were talking about training the brain, but in all of your music perception experiments, have you looked specifically at the difference between children who are congenitally deaf versus adults who later lost their hearing, or older children who lost their hearing later? Is there a big difference in music perception?
There's a huge difference on many levels. Okay, so first of all, musical expectations are vastly different in the pediatric population with early implantation. They have no form or concept of music compared to an adult who lost their hearing later. And so there's not this disappointment, frustration factor. The other thing is that the hearing results in general for somebody who's implanted early are always strikingly good. And so compared to children that are implanted late, there's a lot of CI, musical kids. And it's kind of amazing. There's a smattering of these kids that were implanted early, bilateral CI users that are really high-level musicians, outperforming their technology, even on instruments that you have to intonate by ear. And then it actually baffles my understanding of the entire field that they can do this. I suspect that there's some low-frequency hearing that's allowing them to tune. Adults, again, a wide range like anything else. And so you definitely see that there's some adults that do quite well. There's a couple of impressive CI users that are kind of like, wow, like how can they really, like true star performers that, again, seem to outperform their technology. But if you just look at kind of averages, most adult CI users a little frustrated with music. Most children are not. Most children tend to favor rhythmic, heavy music. That just might be true for kids in general, but definitely true for the CI population.
Hey, Charles. Thanks so much for coming down from San Francisco for this. This is from probably an ignorant laryngology perspective about ear, because I've forgotten most of my ear training already. But is the tonotopic mapping in the cochlea, is that linear, or do we know? Because I was noticing on the images of the radiographic images of the cochlear implant that all the stimulating electrodes are very evenly spaced, right? And that's, I'm sure, due to distance that you have to maintain between the electrodes. But musically, pitches are not, it's logarithmic rather than linear, right? So does it make more sense to?
You're absolutely right. So the tonotopicity is logarithmic. Pitches are logarithmic. Implants are not built logarithmically. However, they're programmed logarithmically. They're not programmed perfectly logarithmically because you're still trying to get to the nearest neighbor. And so there's a difference in pitch resolution. It's the pitch dilemma is different at the low end of the keyboard versus the high end of the keyboard for those reasons. It's a much bigger pitch difference at the lower frequency between one note to the next than in the higher frequency range. But that's one of a good example of how we don't have it quite right.
So does it make sense to try to space the electrodes differently for music then?
Sort of, except when you get really tight spacing on an electrode, there's complete channel chaos. You can't separate the electricity. It's like if I'm trying to hit you with a water spray bottle from here and separate that from hitting Tina. I can't do it because I just don't have the precision of firing. And so that's true whether or not the electrode is here or right here. But if I'm right there, I might have a better chance of hitting a different target. Thanks, Kwang. Appreciate it. Yeah, I know we're over time. I didn't mean to make you late.
I know we have another musician who wants to ask.
Thank you so much for your talk today. I was wondering, based on the research that you presented, if you have advice for when patients come in, given the limitations that we have with cochlear implants, if you have recommendations for patients that are looking to enjoy music more, what those might be for altering the audio in terms of taking out more of the bass or elevating the vocals more, given the current technology state that we're in right now, something that we can apply to patients in clinic.
Yeah, thanks. So unfortunately, it's not simple advice. And so it kind of depends how invested you are in the question, what you want to get out of it. A couple of things. I really recommend that everybody who cares about this topic get a piano keyboard, either an electronic one or an actual piano, and start figuring out, just go up and down the range of the piano keyboard and figure out where you're in tune or out of tune and where your problem areas are. If you're going to do musical training, I recommend picking an instrument that you don't have to tune by ear. So not something like a violin where you have to hear it, or trombone, but something that's discrete, like a piano or a guitar where it's producing the pitch for you. I also recommend using a tuner if you're doing something acoustic, so you can actually see how close you are to the pitch. In terms of like simple manipulations for a, like say, like a radio setting, like I don't know that it matters that much, to be honest with you. You can't do a vocal boost easily, but it's an upper mid-range frequency boost if you wanted to do it that way. So if you had an equalizer, you'd say try to boost the upper mids if you want to hear lyrics better. But it kind of depends what you're interested in, what kind of music you're listening to, and also how your implant is programmed. And so it may be that turning up the bass just may not matter at all for a CI user, but in general, they're bass deficient. So turning up the bass is a reasonable recommendation. Also, starting out with things where the rhythmic information is the sort of centerpiece might be a better way to start than something where it's really complex pitch and strange intervals.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, thank you all for your time. Really appreciate it. Great to see you all.
Thank you, Sean.